We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
On the morning Tomasso stepped to the podium, nothing about the case itself had changed. Nancy Guthrie was still missing. She was still 84 years old. She still required medication she did not take with her. Her phone was still inside the house. Her doorbell camera had still gone offline at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. Her pacemaker monitoring system had still disconnected at 2:28 a.m. Those facts were steady. What changed that morning was posture. For weeks, Tomasso had not spoken publicly. While Savannah Guthrie appeared repeatedly in interviews and at press briefings, asking for help and urging the public to come forward, Tomasso remained present but silent. He stood behind attorneys. He avoided extended statements. He did not step forward voluntarily to address the public. Silence, in an investigation like this, is not automatically suspicious. Attorneys often advise clients not to speak publicly. Family members sometimes choose privacy. There are many legitimate reasons to remain quiet, but silence has weight. And when it ends, that moment carries meaning. Tomasso walked to the podium deliberately. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at the room. And he said, "I was there that night." Those 4 words did not introduce new physical evidence. They did not identify a suspect. They did not answer where Nancy is, but they shifted the narrative. Until that statement, the timeline inside the house had been described in general terms. Law enforcement confirmed Nancy was last seen the night of January 31st. They confirmed the absence of forced entry. They confirmed the abduction was classified as targeted. No forced entry is not a small detail. It means doors were not broken. It means windows were not shattered. It means whoever entered the home either had permission, access, or familiarity. That detail alone narrowed the field from stranger invasion to known access. When Tomasso placed himself inside the house that night, he did something important. He moved from peripheral figure to central timeline participant. Investigators already knew whether he had been present. They do not rely on press conferences to establish physical location. But the public did not know. And public posture can matter in a case like this, because investigations are not only about physical evidence, they are also about consistency. Consistency between what someone says and what the evidence independently shows. Tomasso described tension. He described an argument. He referenced legal and financial changes Nancy had been making. Context matters here. According to reporting from sources familiar with the case, Nancy had been reviewing aspects of her estate planning in the weeks before her disappearance. She had consulted her attorney. She had asked questions. She had considered adjustments. Those changes are not unusual for someone in their 80s. But when changes intersect with conflict, they become part of investigative context, not as motive, as environment. When Tomasso acknowledged being there, investigators did not ask whether he was present. They already knew. The question became, does his account align with everything else recorded that night? That includes digital records, security system access logs, phone data, and one device that could not be turned off from across the room. Nancy's pacemaker. Modern pacemakers do not simply regulate heart rhythm. They record continuously. They timestamp fluctuations. They log sudden changes in rate and rhythm. Many contain motion sensors that detect movement. The Bluetooth connection between Nancy's pacemaker and her phone ceased at 2:28 a.m. That does not mean the device stopped recording. It means the transmission stopped. The internal log continued. If an argument occurred inside that house, the body would have responded. Elevated heart rate is a predictable physiological reaction to stress. In someone with Nancy's cardiac history, that elevation would be detected. This is not speculation about guilt. It is analysis of technology. If Nancy experienced fear, confrontation, or sudden distress, the device would have captured it. Investigators reportedly sought access to that data through legal process. If obtained, it provides a timeline that does not rely on memory. Human memory shifts. Digital systems log. Biology records. When Tomasso described tension that evening, investigators would naturally compare that description to any cardiac event logged during that period. If his timeline aligns with physiological data, that supports his account. If it diverges, that raises questions. There is another detail that intersects here, the security system. Reporting from sources connected to the case suggests that gaps in the home's surveillance recordings were not random technical failures. Instead, they appeared during specific windows. More importantly, those gaps were reportedly created using correct login credentials. That distinction is critical. A hacked system suggests external intrusion. A system accessed with correct credentials suggests knowledge. Knowledge of passwords, knowledge of system layout, knowledge of how to disable recording without triggering obvious alarms. This is reported information, not officially confirmed by law enforcement on the record. But if accurate, it narrows the category of who could have accessed that system. Someone familiar with the home, someone who understood how it worked. When Tomasso said he was there, he stepped directly into that narrowing circle. Again, that does not equal guilt. It equals proximity to key variables. Then he added something else. He said Nancy was not alone. Those words introduced a second presence into the timeline, a second individual inside the home that night, not publicly named, not publicly described in detail, but acknowledged. That acknowledgement does two things. First, it expands the timeline beyond a two-person dynamic. Second, it complicates responsibility. If more than one person was present, then reconstruction becomes layered. Who arrived first? Who left? Who accessed systems? Who interacted with Nancy during the final recorded hours? Investigators will not rely on public statements alone to answer those questions. They will examine cell tower data, Wi-Fi connections, security access logs, vehicle movement, and any communication sent during or after the critical window. According to reporting from sources cited in connection with this case, a text message was sent from a phone associated with Tomasso shortly after the pacemaker transmission ended. The reported content of that message was a single word: handled. That detail has not been formally confirmed in an official statement by law enforcement. It is attributed to reporting from named outlets citing investigative sources. If accurate, the word choice matters. Language carries intent. Handled is not the language of confusion. It implies completion. It implies report back. Investigators analyze not only what was said, but when it was said and to whom. If that message was sent to a prepaid phone, the kind that can be purchased anonymously, that adds another layer of inquiry. Who owned that phone? Where was it purchased? Where was it physically located at the time of the message? This is where control becomes central. Tomasso's public posture was controlled. His admission was measured. His phrasing was precise. In investigations, control is not automatically incriminating, but it draws attention, because crises usually produce visible instability. When someone maintains composure under extreme scrutiny, investigators ask why. Is it personality, preparation, legal guidance, or something else? Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st. Her son-in-law has placed himself inside the house that night. He has confirmed tension. He has confirmed a second presence. The security system was reportedly accessed using correct credentials. The pacemaker likely logged biological responses throughout the night. These are the structural elements investigators are now overlaying carefully. In cases built on physical evidence, emotion often fades into the background, not because it does not matter, but because time becomes the organizing principle. When Tomasso said he was inside the house that night, he did not just step into the narrative. He stepped into a timeline, and timelines are precise. Nancy's doorbell camera went offline at 1:47 a.m. Motion was detected at 2:12 a.m., but no footage was saved. Her pacemaker monitoring connection stopped transmitting at 2:28 a.m. Those are not approximations, they are recorded times. When investigators reconstruct events, they do not begin with suspicion. They begin with sequence. Who was present at 9:30 p.m., who left at 10:15 p.m., who sent a message at 2:31 a.m. Each data point becomes a coordinate. Tomasso described an argument that evening. He described tension related to legal and financial decisions Nancy had been making. If that argument occurred before midnight, investigators would ask whether Nancy's pacemaker logged any notable cardiac elevation during that period. If it occurred closer to 1:30 a.m., they would look even more carefully. The body reacts instantly. Fear produces measurable acceleration in heart rate. Sustained stress produces patterns of variability. If Nancy experienced sudden distress at 1:46 a.m., 1 minute before the doorbell camera went dark, that alignment would matter. If no such spike appears, that matters too. Pacemaker data is not emotional. It is mathematical. Modern implantable cardiac devices record continuously. They log deviations from programmed thresholds. They store rhythm disturbances. Some include accelerometers capable of detecting physical movement patterns. The internal battery powers all of this independently. When the Bluetooth transmission stopped at 2:28 a.m., the internal log did not stop. That internal data becomes a silent timeline. Investigators reportedly sought access to that data through legal process directed at the device manufacturer. If obtained, they would not simply glance at it. They would overlay it. Overlay it against security system access logs, Wi-Fi router activity, phone movement data, text message timestamps, vehicle telematics if available. If Tomasso said the argument ended at 1:15 a.m., but Nancy's pacemaker recorded a dramatic spike at 1:50 a.m., that discrepancy would demand explanation. If he said he left at 1:30 a.m., but phone data shows his device stationary inside the home at 2:10 a.m., that matters. Investigations of this level are rarely about a single dramatic inconsistency. They are about small misalignments that accumulate. Now consider the security system. Reporting from sources connected to the case suggests the surveillance gaps were not random. They occurred in defined windows and were reportedly accessed using correct credentials. If that reporting is accurate, investigators would examine login timestamps carefully. When was the system accessed? From which device? From which IP address? Was it accessed locally inside the house or remotely? If the login occurred at 1:44 a.m., 3 minutes before the camera went offline, that matters. If it occurred earlier in the evening and the disablement was scheduled, that matters too. Security systems keep logs. Even when footage is erased, metadata often remains. That metadata can show usernames used, time of access, duration of session, device fingerprint. If Tomasso had legitimate access to those credentials, investigators would not treat that as proof of wrongdoing. They would treat it as access. Access narrows possibility. It does not determine guilt. Now let us bring in the reported text message. According to reporting attributed to sources familiar with the investigation, a message reading, handled, was sent from a phone associated with Tomasso shortly after 2:28 a.m. Again, this has not been formally confirmed in an official law enforcement statement. It remains reported information. If accurate, investigators would examine several elements: time sent, cell tower location, recipient device identity, whether the prepaid phone on the receiving end had communicated previously with that device, whether it activated shortly before that night. If the prepaid phone was purchased days earlier with cash, that timeline becomes part of the case. If it was activated within hours of the event, that becomes significant. The word itself also matters. Language analysis is not theatrical, it is contextual. Handled suggests resolution. It implies a report to someone waiting. Investigators would ask, waiting for what? But again, context must be careful. One word without surrounding conversation can be misleading. Was it in response to a different issue? Was it part of a longer thread? Was it isolated? Digital forensics examines entire message chains, not fragments. Now let us consider the second person Tomasso referenced. When he said Nancy was not alone, he introduced another presence. If that person was physically present, their digital footprint would exist. Phone pings, vehicle entry, Wi-Fi connection, security camera metadata. If no digital trace of a second phone appears inside the home during the relevant window, that inconsistency would raise questions. If a second device appears but leaves abruptly at 2:20 a.m., that timing matters. In high-level investigations, minutes become anchors. From 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., 41 minutes passed, 41 minutes in which the camera was disabled. Motion was detected. Transmission stopped. If Nancy's pacemaker shows sudden movement at 2:05 a.m., investigators would examine who was still inside the house at that moment. If it shows no abnormal event until 2:25 a.m., that shifts the reconstruction. Timelines do not accuse. They align or they conflict. There is also the matter of desert cell tower data referenced in reporting. If a phone associated with anyone present that night moved from the Catalina foothills toward remote terrain shortly after 2:30 a.m., that movement would be mapped carefully. Cell tower triangulation does not provide exact coordinates, but it establishes direction and range. If a device pinged a tower near desert washes 30 minutes after the pacemaker transmission ended, that sequence would be examined in detail. But again, this remains analytically supported reporting, not officially confirmed in public statements. Now consider something quieter: institutional credibility. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has faced scrutiny during this investigation. A unanimous no-confidence vote was reported. A recall effort exists. Statements from former officials have raised concerns about early scene management. In that context, the FBI's involvement becomes critical. Federal investigations rely heavily on digital and biological evidence because those forms of proof withstand courtroom scrutiny. Tomasso's admission places him within the timeline. The pacemaker may contain biological confirmation of events. The security system metadata may contain access confirmation. Phone data may contain movement confirmation. Each layer either supports or contradicts his account. And contradictions do not need to be dramatic. They only need to be measurable. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st. Her son-in-law has acknowledged being inside the home. He has acknowledged tension. He has acknowledged a second presence. The question investigators are now reconstructing is not emotional. It is chronological. What happened between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m.? And does every statement made publicly align with what the data independently recorded? When someone chooses to speak publicly in the middle of an active investigation, timing is rarely accidental. It may be advised by counsel. It may be prompted by internal pressure. It may be shaped by awareness that investigators already know more than they have revealed. But it is almost never random. Tomasso remained silent for weeks. He did not address the media early in the search. He did not make emotional appeals. He did not volunteer a detailed timeline until that press conference. Then, suddenly, he did. The question investigators quietly ask in moments like that is not, why did he speak? It is, why did he speak now? Public admissions can serve multiple purposes. They can preempt discovery. They can frame narrative. They can establish a version of events before contradictory evidence emerges, or they can simply reflect a decision that silence is no longer sustainable. In serious investigations, law enforcement often conducts interviews long before any press conference occurs. By the time someone steps to a microphone, detectives have usually already compared their private statements to digital evidence, security logs, and biological timelines. If Tomasso's public statement mirrored what he had already told investigators privately, that consistency matters. If it introduced new elements not previously disclosed, that matters even more. The introduction of a second person inside the house was not a minor addition. It shifted responsibility from a two-person interaction to a three-person environment. And environments complicate cases, because responsibility diffuses when more people are present. Investigators must then determine who arrived first, who left last, who interacted directly with Nancy during the final recorded window, who had access to the security credentials, who possessed or contacted the prepaid phone. Publicly acknowledging another presence can serve two very different psychological functions. It can be transparency, or it can be distribution. Distribution of attention, distribution of suspicion, distribution of narrative focus. This is not accusation. It is structural analysis. When a crisis unfolds, people tend to react in one of two broad ways. Some become visibly overwhelmed, others become highly controlled. Control is not inherently suspicious. Many people default to composure under stress, but control during a criminal investigation invites scrutiny because it often signals preparation. Prepared individuals think about sequencing, what to say first, what to omit, what to introduce gradually. Tomasso's statement was deliberate. He acknowledged presence. He described argument. He introduced a second individual. He referenced financial tension. Each element moved the narrative slightly outward from himself. Again, this does not determine intent. It shapes perception. Now consider the broader environment. The sheriff's department has faced public criticism. A no-confidence vote was reported. Questions about early scene management have circulated. Institutional strain can create uncertainty within a community. In such an environment, public statements carry extra weight. They can stabilize perception or destabilize it. If investigators believe Tomasso's presence was already widely suspected, stepping forward could serve to normalize it, to remove surprise. to appear cooperative. If they believed digital or biological evidence might soon surface confirming his presence at specific times, acknowledging it beforehand could reduce the appearance of concealment. In criminal investigations, one of the most damaging factors is being caught contradicting objective data. Investigators know this. Attorneys know this, which is why timing often intersects with evidence awareness. Let us return briefly to the reported text message, the word handled. If that message exists as reported, and if it was sent shortly after the pacemaker transmission ceased, investigators would examine not only its content, but its psychological placement. Was it sent before public awareness of Nancy's disappearance? Was it sent after? Was it in anticipation of something? Language can reflect internal state, but it must always be contextualized. One word without surrounding dialogue can mislead interpretation, and responsible analysis requires restraint. Now let us examine the second person. If that individual exists, as Tomasso confirmed, investigators already know whether that person has been interviewed. They know whether phone records place them inside the house. They know whether their DNA appears in the mixed sample recovered. The public does not, which means Tomasso's admission could serve one of two purposes: to align with evidence already in investigators' possession, or to introduce complexity into a narrative that had previously felt singular. Complexity can delay clarity, but clarity often emerges from contradiction. If the second person's account matches Tomasso's timeline precisely, that strengthens consistency. If it diverges, investigators gain leverage. When two individuals describe the same evening differently, even in small details, those inconsistencies become pressure points. Pressure points do not always break cases immediately, but they accumulate. There is also the question of motivation. Nancy had reportedly been reviewing estate changes. Such decisions can create emotional friction within families, but friction does not equal crime. Investigators examine financial movements carefully in cases involving vulnerable adults. Were any transfers made? Were any beneficiary changes documented? Did anyone stand to gain from immediate access versus delayed inheritance? These are routine investigative questions. They are not conclusions. When Tomasso referenced financial tension publicly, he may have been acknowledging something investigators were already aware of. Transparency can appear cooperative, but it also establishes narrative framing. It suggests context rather than concealment. In high-profile investigations, public narrative often influences perception long before charges are filed, which brings us back to timing. If investigators are quietly building a case, they do not announce every development. They allow data to converge: digital logs, security access, biological samples, cell tower movements. If those elements align in a way that contradicts public statements, arrests can come suddenly. If they align in a way that supports them, suspicion can dissipate. At this stage, what exists is structure. Tomasso has placed himself inside the timeline. He has acknowledged tension. He has introduced a second presence. The pacemaker may contain biological timestamps. The security system may contain access logs. Phone data may contain movement patterns. And investigators are comparing all of it against every public word spoken. In long investigations, there is often a period that feels still. Press conferences slow down. Official updates become brief. Public speculation fills the silence. But inside that silence, something else usually happens. Comparison. Not dramatic breakthroughs, not sudden confessions. Careful comparison of every independent data source against every statement that has been made. In Nancy Guthrie's case, several streams of information exist. There is the digital stream, there is the biological stream, and there is the human stream. When those three intersect cleanly, cases move. When they conflict, pressure builds. Let us begin with the digital. Security system access logs, if preserved, contain timestamps and user credentials. They reveal when the system was entered and from where. If those logs show remote access using correct credentials at a specific time, investigators will ask who had those credentials. If Tomasso had authorized access to that system, that fact alone does not imply wrongdoing. It establishes capability. Capability narrows the field. Phone records form another layer. Investigators do not simply look at call logs. They analyze location pings, tower handoffs, Wi-Fi connections, device-to-device proximity. If a phone remained stationary inside the house until 2:25 a.m., that matters. If it moved toward remote desert terrain minutes later, that matters too. Again, not as accusation, as alignment. Now the biological stream. Nancy's pacemaker may contain a minute-by-minute record of cardiac activity during the critical window. If there was a sudden spike at 1:48 a.m., investigators would compare that against who was present. If movement was detected at 2:05 a.m., they would examine which devices remained connected inside the house at that moment. If cardiac variability changed abruptly before 2:28 a.m., they would ask what external event could have triggered that shift. Biological data does not lie intentionally, but interpretation requires context. Then there is the reported mixed DNA recovered from inside the home. Separating mixed profiles is complex. It requires laboratory deconvolution. It can take months. But once isolated, each profile becomes either identifiable or not. If a profile matches someone who had no legitimate reason to be inside the home, that becomes central. If it matches someone who acknowledged being present, that must align with their explanation. If it does not match anyone currently known, that introduces an entirely new dimension. Now consider behavioral evidence, public statements, tone, timing, content. Tomasso's admission placed him inside the house. He described tension. He introduced a second person. If his private interviews align perfectly with his public account, investigators evaluate consistency. If small discrepancies exist, differences in time, sequence, or emphasis, those are examined. In courtroom settings, cases are rarely won by dramatic single pieces of evidence. They are built on convergence. Digital logs that match biological data that aligns with movement patterns that correspond to communication records. If the reported, handled message exists and was sent within minutes of the pacemaker transmission ending, investigators would examine its timing against everything else. If it was sent from inside the home before departure, that matters. If it was sent from a different location, that matters too. But context determines weight. One isolated word is not a verdict. It becomes meaningful only if it aligns with other independent streams. There is also the matter of the second person. If that individual exists, investigators already know whether their phone was present, whether their DNA appears, whether their timeline matches Tomasso's. If everything aligns, suspicion diffuses. If contradictions emerge, pressure concentrates. This is where silence from federal investigators becomes instructive. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has described cases like this as fire hose investigations, meaning more data than can be publicly processed at once. Silence does not necessarily mean stagnation. It can mean integration. Now step back from the details. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She disappeared from inside a home with no forced entry. Her security system was reportedly accessed with correct credentials. Her pacemaker likely recorded physiological data during the final hours she was known to be alive. Her son-in-law has acknowledged being present and confirmed another individual was there. That is the structural outline. What remains unresolved publicly is convergence. When digital, biological, and behavioral evidence align without contradiction, investigators act. If alignment already exists internally, public silence can precede swift movement. If alignment remains incomplete, the quiet phase continues. Institutional strain within the sheriff's department adds complexity, but does not erase federal involvement. The FBI does not step back from cases involving potential abduction and cross-jurisdictional digital evidence. They wait for convergence. For viewers who have followed major investigations over decades, you recognize this pattern. Weeks of noise, months of silence, then a single announcement that reframes everything. Or, in some cases, a gradual narrowing that becomes visible only in hindsight. At this stage, no one has been publicly charged. No one has been officially named as a suspect. All individuals remain presumed innocent unless proven otherwise in a court of law. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. The pacemaker's internal record may still hold data investigators have yet to fully interpret. Security logs may still be under forensic review. DNA profiles may still be in laboratory separation. The question is not whether evidence exists. It is whether it aligns. And when it does, if it does, the public will not learn through speculation. It will arrive in the form of formal action. Until then, analysis must remain careful, distinguishing confirmed fact from reported information, separating inference from accusation, watching timing, watching silence, watching for convergence. If you have information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie on January 31st or February 1st, 2026, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. Information can be provided anonymously. A reward remains available for information leading to answers. Cases built on digital and biological evidence do not resolve emotionally. They resolve mathematically. And mathematics, once complete, leaves very little room for doubt.